All right, so this session's a little bit different because it's not a PowerPoint presentation, but it's not quite a discussion yet, although it will be very quickly. This session has evolved from over the years from various things, from mock grant reviews, mock IRB reviews, open-ended discussions, and where we've sort of landed is just to get a little break and have something very practical in terms of studies and almost to put yourself in the role of the IRB. We've generated a couple of research study scenarios, and rather than, I want to say rather than having you read them before, but that's just because we didn't choose them in time to get them printed or sent to you. We're so busy. So we're just going to put them on the screen. They're short, and we're going to ask you to read them, and then we're going to have some discussion about what potential ethical issues are. The first one is related to studies with drug users in the criminal justice system, and the second one is related to studies about PrEP. So they'll overlap. We tried to choose stuff that might overlap with some of your some of your MRPs, but at least would be close to. So let's just put up and read. So I would say just in general that what this case study touches on is issues with incarcerated populations, right, with overlap a number of historic RETI projects, as well as issues related to some of the things we've talked about sort of equipoise and the conditions you're offered and things that are acceptable. And our hope is that we'll just have a discussion just about the practical, so not so much abstract principles based, but what do you do in terms of reviewing the study and what would you anticipate the roadblocks are? And what would your strategies be necessary to address those roadblocks? And I will talk at the end a little bit about some of the roadblocks I've had in doing similar work in treatment courts, although they probably won't be the roadblocks that you expect. So does anyone have, and I like this because I find drug courts are provocative. So does anyone have any sort of initial reactions to whether this existing world is even ethical? Start with that.
It may be hard for participants to tell apart the study from the legal requirement to be in the program. Yeah.
There's an analogy to therapeutic misconception.
Sorry.
How would you address that?
I mean, I think this kind of research needs to be done with people who are incarcerated, right? Because that's the purpose of the research. So I think you would have to outline how you would clarify these potential concerns with potential participants and the process that you would, I don't know, assess their level of comprehension, like some teach back, something like that. I'm not so sure if it has been used in this context, but something like that.
Right, I think we've talked around with most of the discussions we've had and most of the discussions, if not all, we'll have going forward. It's that research participants are participating in research in the environments which relate to the reasons we're working with them, right? And so there's always the question of what's different about participating in the research study. So some cases, if you're most removed, you might recruit people on the street because they're members of a particular group, right, which has its own set of ethical context and questions. But in a lot of cases, you're working with people in settings in which they're already receiving some kind of, I don't want to just say services, but let's, for argument's sake, they're receiving some kind of services. So how do they know either that this isn't part of the same service, right? How do they know they could get a placebo in some of the examples we've talked about? Or how do they know they're not required to do this? You know, we all say there's that line in every consent form that says, no treatment or service will be withheld based on your decision to participate, right? And how is that heard by participants, right?
It's at the end of the process, so it's not heard. It's way at, it's on the last page.
Right. But can you hear that, for instance, if it's coming from a judge or from your oncologist, right? Can you know, how are there ways that this is all aspirational, right? We're never going to get perfect at this, but what are strategies you might use to try to separate those two things for people? Or alternatively, is it ethical to do these in settings where they can't be separated, right? I mean, is it ethical to do research in settings where people are mandated to be in those settings?
So, I mean, a similar question with one of my studies by the IRB, but people do get to choose if they put that judge choice, right? They could choose prison, whatever the outcome is, or they could choose drug courts, and people don't always choose to go into treatment. So that is a choice that they made. So they did make a choice to be there. So, and if you can separate what you're doing from that decision, then, from that situation, then I would think, yes, it is an ethical place to do research.
Okay, right.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to do that in general is to be sensitive to who's actually approaching the prospective participant. And if it's someone who is reasonably trustworthy in their minds versus someone who is in some other organizational capacity, I think you're more likely to be able to make that separation. So obviously, if it is the prison guard who says, waving the baton or banging, we'd like you to be in a research study, you're free to say no. that's not really a choice, right? And the whole idea of the prison regulations was that when the common rule was created, it was this understanding that people in certain organizational settings simply were not able, they weren't living in it, they weren't, anyway, autonomy was never valued in a way that made that possible. So I think, so again, it's to this idea of, is there someone whose role is to advocate on behalf of the incarcerated individuals? Is there even a representative of the incarcerated individuals who can be a kind of liaison and say, would you like to be approached by a member of the research team? And that way, we always call these ward-off procedures because we thought it was easier for people to say, I don't even want to know about this, I'm not interested, or sure, I'm happy to talk to someone. So in a sense, what you can do, and this is true for any recruitment, right? You allow for a step between the approach by the researcher, if possible.
David, now I'm concerned if this is a trusted person who people know, okay, this person got my best interest in mind, not the guard. I wouldn't want the guard either. But then if that person comes and gives me information, I'm more likely to say yes, because I trust that person.
The intermediary. Oh, I think what David's saying is, so the social worker in the prison, let's say, comes to the to the person.
If the social
And
worker.
just says, would you be willing to talk to are you interested in talking to someone from the research team? Then the research team.
You know that research team is shady, you wouldn't even have come to me and offered me that research team.
So here's the thing, it sounds great, this idea of having a representative and advocate, someone else. Of the studies that I've seen, and I don't know quite the details of all the RETI studies that have worked in criminal justice, I've never heard of anyone other than the researcher approaching, right? So.
Well, this is interesting. So I was just thinking, so Stacy Ryan Petit did a study on this, right? In terms of drug courts and she was one of our fellows for adolescents. And so she did the study with the parents and the kids, and the person that did the recruiting was the, when they're out, what's it called?
Probation officer.
Yeah, the probation officer. And we thought the whole study was going to be about coercion from the probation officer. They could care less. I mean, that they didn't feel coerced because the probation officer tells them lots of stuff that they either do or don't do. So they really didn't, kind of feel coerced about that. And what was interesting was what they resented the most was in this particular study, the parents were going to be paid to actually attend because a lot of times parents don't attend. So it was supposed to be, and they just thought the randomization was unfair because some would get more money than others. That was basically it.
Right, I think first of all, it's hard for us, it's hard for an IRB, it's hard for anyone but people who know the inside of the operation to make the determination. I think, and that's why, the IRB would struggle and maybe come up with the wrong decision about this. But the question is, who could fairly and in a way that will neither over-recruit or under-recruit subjects be someone who can be the first approach?
But it's a good idea, but it doesn't always work because to get that independent person and situate in there, it doesn't mean they trust that person anymore. But it's not that it's a bad idea, but let me just, if we look at subpart C, right, which is specifically for detained individuals, there are all these guidelines to protect, and one of them is you have to have a prison representative on the IRB. In addition, you have to make sure that that you're studying things that you also study outside, so you're not explaining, or that is so specific to the detention situation that it's important to study. So I guess my point is that there are adequate, and you're not supposed to be exploitive and all those kinds of things. So adequate protections can be built in. One of them may be a independent support system, but it doesn't have to be that. There can be other added protections. One of the protections is it's not allowed to be used for parole. That's right in the federal regulations that you can't use their participation, to be in parole. You have to be very careful about what the incentives are, right? That things could be stolen from them if you give them too many incentives. So so the point is that David, I think what you're talking about is one type of protection, but it's not necessary
So-
all the time. Yeah, Cynthia.
So, we spent 2 years, the student medicine, trying to debate this, and interviewed many prisoners around the country. We went to different prisons, and one of the things that, for me at least, and not everyone agreed with the outcome of that Institute of Medicine study, but we really did hear the voices of prisoners who really felt that they had, it was yet another deprivation of being able to become research participants. Now, they understood the separation we were making was medical research, where so many of the abuses had happened, versus behavioral research, and trying to separate those as well. And so the prisoners themselves really wanted to participate in certain research. And it was, not an easy, it was a very complex process to keep trying to balance the protection with the autonomy. I mean, it was really very interesting, though, to hear from the population itself.
I will
So I
say
just wanted to add
just
that.
in the interest of time, because we want to do one more case study and this presentation. A couple of practical things. The most recent RETI project in the criminal justice system was was Matt's 2 years ago. He just finished data collection. We got an email, he finished data collection, the first session of this institute. This is a year after he ideally would have presented his data. Two things. One, he's a physician working in the Department of Corrections, collected the data himself, or arranged it. There was no intermediary in that study. His biggest delay was that it took, I think, about a year for the IRB to get a prisoner representative post-COVID. And so his study just languished. So that's one practical. Second practical thing is I probably should have prefaced this by saying I've done a lot of work in drug courts, and I'm the evaluator for the Brooklyn Treatment Court in New York. And 100% of the people who come to me and say, I want to do research in drug courts, I tell them to do research in treatment programs affiliated with drug courts, because you will never get a judge to randomly assign, no matter how close you are to the judge.
Exactly. Yeah.
And number three, just to another practical thing is I, for years, begged, maybe not quite begged, asked vociferously for the NYU Washington Square IRB to review my drug court protocols. These are SAMHSA funded grants that are essentially program evaluation. I finally got them to give me a letter saying they won't review them because they did not consider it research, and we wanted to do conference presentations and publications, and it was an effort to get them just to say it's exempt. I
Right.
didn't want it to be exempt. I actually wanted someone to say, do this, don't do this, but there was no to do that. So they're just sort of practical considerations.